Thank you so much, Tracy. My goodness, really pleased to be here and have this opportunity today to touch on some of the issues related to accessibility, assessments, and what's in the law. As you know, there has been lots going on with the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as the Every Student Succeeds Act. And lots of guidance and dear colleague letters coming out, and there is no way we could even begin to go through what all the laws are and highlight all that's in them. So what we have decided to do today is to just take some specific topics that are very much related to the new laws that have come out and all the new activities going on, and focus on those. So we'll do a bit on kind of the paradigm shift that is out there related to thinking about accessibility and accommodations, and what the implications are of those for working with your districts and helping them kind of figure out what all this confusing language is that they're hearing swirling around. We'll just do a little touch on, what UDL, what the language of UDL is in the design and delivery of assessments. Move on to address just a teeny sliver of some of the issues related to the nationally recognized high school assessments that are allowed in through the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then whip through some of the challenges that we've seen in the technology-based approaches to assessments and to being sure that they are accessible and that they provide accommodations, and maybe some of the related solutions that you as state leaders can think about and potentially apply as you work with your districts. So we also plan to leave time for questions and discussions. Hope you'll kind of note your questions and save them to the end. If there's something that we are really unclear about, feel free to put it in the chat box, and we'll get it addressed before we move too far along. But really, I was thinking, as Sheryl and I were preparing the topics to address, that really, if we really wanted to do a good, thorough job of, what's coming out in the laws, what might be coming out in IDEA, how these are affecting students with disabilities in the areas of assessment, accessibility, accommodations, etc. It would take us many, many hours. So we don't have many hours, so we're going to quickly move through some of the topics I highlighted here, and then hope that as they jog questions in your mind, you'll note those and we can address those later. So the next slide, really kind of whipping through just to make sure we're all on the same page there. Recognized now in the Every Student Succeeds Act are three kinds of assessments, general kinds of state assessments. The general or the regular assessment, we all know that one. That's the one in which most of our students with disabilities participate. Then the alternate assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Previously, we've always kind of added the tag alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards because we had other alternates. We had an alternate based on grade level achievement standards, potentially, and we had an alternate based on modified achievement standards, potentially. And not all states had those, and with the Every Student Succeeds Act, the only recognized alternate assessment is the alternate assessment for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And that's a very small percentage of our students with disabilities. And then we have the recognition of the English language proficiency assessments. And of course, we have students with disabilities who are English learners who participate in that assessment. And so all the issues around assessment, accommodations, accessibility are very relevant for our ELs with disabilities as they participate in both the ELP assessment, the English Language Proficiency assessment, and one of the other two assessments, either the general or regular assessment or the alternate assessment if they have a significant cognitive disability. So that simplifies our life, you would think. But in many ways, it may even make it a little more complicated as we think about who participates in which assessment, and have we got assessments that are the most accessible possible so that the students really are able to participate in a way that shows their knowledge and skills. So looking at the next slide, this is just kind of a historical look at the other kind of plane of change that is happening here, and that for a long time we've been based almost exclusively in paper and pencil tests. We have a long history. There's a long history of development related to those assessments. Over time, they increasingly became more multiple choice only and less often, and some short constructed response, less often longer responding, etc. With even before Every Student Succeeds Act, with some of the race to the top money, the push for technology-based assessments really dramatically increased because funding really supported those efforts. And they're being, as I say here, being expanded and being used with increasing frequency based on the funding out of the race to the top money. And even though I'd say that that funding source emphasized accessibility, it doesn't mean it's always easy to get done right away. And so challenges related to technology-based assessments in terms of their accessibility and in terms of providing accommodations and lots of other issues, there are many challenges there. And so we will touch on those toward the end of the webinar. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see that here's one of the areas where we see a lot of confusion or concern or worry about, I don't really understand this. What I used to know is that we had an assessment and students with disabilities could get an accommodation, and then we needed to think about how do we decide which accommodation the student needs, and what does the state policy say about that when the student participates in an assessment? Is it going to count or not, or do they get a lower score or not? So the world seemed pretty simple back then, even though it wasn't simple, because we had some really difficult decision making that needed to take place to ensure that we were providing appropriate accommodations for instruction and for the assessment. But we have a new paradigm, one that I think in the end is really going to benefit our students, but in the transition is really a challenge. Excuse me. And that is going to this kind of three-tier approach where there are what is called universal features. These are supports of various kinds that are available to all students. The student selects whether to use them or not. These are things like, flagging an item, I want to come back to that item, or highlighting something, perhaps masking part of the answer choices. So these are things that the student himself or herself chooses to use or not. You see in parentheses there, it says may need to be turned off for some, and that brings us to that next designated features kind of tier of accessibility. Designated features are supports that have been determined to be important for all students who need them. But the trick is to identify who really needs these supports. And the notion that it needs to be an adult or a team of adults who are making that decision, perhaps with input from the student and parents, of course that would be ideal, but an adult needs to determine that these features are something that will enable the student to better show or to more accurately show what he or she knows and is able to do, and I'll quickly speed through some examples of these. And then accommodations, the one we're most used to, those kinds of supports that are available only to students with disabilities and or English learners. So whatever that parentheses may need to be turned off is considered generally to be a designated feature. An adult decides that for Johnny, for example, that having all these things that he or she can turn on or off or whatever is too distracting, and so none of them should be available for that student. So a whole new approach, excuse me, complicating this is that different assessments have taken different approaches to what they call these three tiers and to what goes in each of those tiers. So I'm going to just speed through. Are faced with different assessments which may have different names for the different tiers and may have different kinds of supports in the different tiers. So this is an area that as state leads, you can really help your district leads and then schools to understand, what are we actually dealing with, what goes where, etc. So sorry I went on, but if you flip to the next slide, this is a look at the Smarter Balanced framework on the next slide. Here it comes. So Smarter Balanced has three tiers, as you can see: universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. Divides each of them into which ones are embedded within the technology and which ones are not embedded within the technology and need to be provided locally. So for example, in the accommodations, you can see text-to-speech is provided within the technology. Having it read aloud is a non-embedded kind of accommodation. I'm not going to go through all the details of these. If you are in one of the states in Smarter Balanced, you probably know these by heart. Maybe. So the next one is PARCC. So Smarter Balanced and PARCC are the two large regular assessment consortia. So if we go to the next slide, even though it looks slightly different, these may be taking a lot of space and slow to move. So on the next slide with PARCC, you'll see the three levels again. I'm not seeing it yet, so I'm going to wait until we get to PARCC. Here it comes. Lovely colors, slightly different look. Basically the same three-tier approach with features for all students, what they call accessibility features, things identified in advance, and then accommodations. Accommodations within PARCC are available to students with disabilities, IEP or 504, ELs, and ELs with disabilities. It's not quite the same configuration back with Smarter Balanced. And then just for another view, I'm going to flip to one of the English language proficiency assessments, and that's ELPA 21. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the same kind of three-tier approach, and ELPA 21 maybe looks a little closer to Smarter Balanced. It has both that embedded and non-embedded feature. It also breaks out things that are considered to be administrative considerations, whether the student needs more breaks, extended time, maybe a familiar examiner. So anyway, I think you can tell that if I'm sitting in a state that has PARCC as my regular assessment, ELPA 21 as my ELP assessment, and maybe I have my own alternate assessment. I didn't belong to one of the consortia. I have districts and schools and just IEP teams trying to make decisions with three different kinds of arrays of accessibility and accommodations features. Next slide is a quick look at what is in common and what is not in common. And as you can see, the names are different, just at the name level. The names are different, and even different is whether they have all of the 3 tiers. So you get to DLM, and they have supports, but they don't specifically call them accommodations. The ELP assessment has nothing in that middle category, so for the WIDA. So anyway, just to give you some idea of all the complications here, I'm going to move us now to the next slide, which is another area of that causes concerns within the districts and schools, and that is, as we move to technology-based, a way to indicate to the computer, the technology, the iPad, whatever's being used, which of those features that are determined by an adult or an IEP team that the student needs, how they actually get activated within the technology system. So most of the consortia assessments refer to a personal needs profile, and this is a digital version of which kid, each individual kid gets which features and accommodations. And it means somebody has to be putting this information in, and it takes a lot of coordination at the school level to make sure that happens very smoothly. You'll see here the name ISAP. I've got that in there because it's a version of a personal needs profile that Smarter Balanced uses. So won't dwell on that, but it's one little slide, and it represents quite a bit of work at the district and school level in order to get the correct information in so that students get the accessibility features and the accommodations that they should be getting based on what's in their IEP. Okay, so move on to the next slide, and just one last complication area, and that is with our move to technology-based assessments and encouraged by the funding out of Race to the Top, we have the opportunity to have much more innovative item types. They really were promoted, and I listed just kind of 3 of them here. One is the drag and drop. You might see a simulation of a fish tank, and you're supposed to say what you would do in an experiment, and this is kind of a science one, and move, so much salt into one place, and, much more engaging potentially, but also potentially having many more accessibility challenges for students with disabilities. So drag and drop, providing audio or video stimuli within the items, allowing for multiple responses, so pick the 2 best, or that kind of technology-based innovative item type. They all create some additional kinds of complications for accessibility and for realizing what the test requires of the student, how that interacts with the student's disability needs. And then there's a few others I've listed here, like the adaptivity and whether that works well for students with disabilities. And then the push for, well, one of the advantages is that we can get our reports back on students much, much more quickly, and that we can embed those accommodations. So this has been, I've just started this off with a whirlwind of kind of the ground, how it's been shifting for us, and how I think that impacts those who are making decisions for individual kids, those who are coordinating what's going on in the various schools and the district, etc. It's become a much more complicated world in many ways, and what we need to do, or you need to do as states, is to help ensure that that doesn't get in the way of students getting the accessibility and accommodations that they need to have to be able to show what they really know and are able to do. Whew. So I tried to do that quickly, and I'm going to turn it over now to Sheryl to take you through just a few more of the good things, that we see in the law and how they might impact what's going on, as well as, some of the other provisions in the law that will mean particular challenges for our students with disabilities. So, Sheryl.
Thank you, Martha. Next slide, please. One of the things that is really exciting, really good in ESSA is that ESSA includes some information about requirements for universal design for learning. Now, universal design for learning really, provides an opportunity to use strategies, technologies that will make instruction and assessment a lot more accessible for many students with disabilities as well as other students. ESSA uses the definition of UDL that is in the Higher Education Opportunity Act, which is provide flexibility in the ways information is presented, in the ways students respond or demonstrate knowledge and skills, and the ways students are engaged. It reduces barriers in instruction, provides appropriate accommodations, supports and challenges, and maintains high achievement expectations for all students, including students with disabilities. Now, UDL is mentioned many places in ESSA, including it's mentioned in the section on innovative assessments, on comprehensive literacy instruction, state use of funds. But the one place that I really want to focus on here is that it's included in the state plans. And state plans must show that they've implemented a set of high-quality student academic assessments in mathematics, reading, or language arts and science, and that these assessments should be developed to the extent practical using the principles of universal design. Next slide. Now, another piece of that's something else that's in ESSA that's new is that there's a recognition that states may use a nationally recognized high school assessment instead of the state assessment. This would be assessments such as ACT, SAT, would also include Smarter Balanced and PARCC, because they are assessments that are used by multiple states, as well as some of the tests that are currently used at the college level, such as AccuPlacer might also fit into this category. For the assessment to be considered a nationally recognized high school assessment, it needs to be administered in multiple states, recognized by institutions of higher education for entrance or placement, be aligned to challenging state standards, produce valid and reliable data, and apply to all high school students except for those who participate in alternate assessments, and that it has available appropriate accommodations. The way it's in ESSA, all states will need to establish an application process to LEAs, that an LEA can make the decision that they think they might like to use one of these nationally recognized high school assessments. And so states need to develop an application process that the LEAs can use. And then it can be either approved or not approved at the state level. Once it's approved for any one district, once an assessment is approved for any one district in a state for use as a nationally recognized high school assessment, any district in the state can use it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, what I really want to focus on is how accommodations are included in some of these high school assessments. And NCEO recently published a report where we're looking at the accommodations policies of ACT, SAT, PARCC, and Smarter Balanced. There was variation in the frameworks that were used across these four assessments. PARCC and Smarter Balanced both use the three-tiered framework that Martha talked about, whereas ACT and SAT focused on whether or not a score was college reportable. And depending upon whether or not a student had used accommodations which had been approved by ACT or SAT, that had been approved. If they were approved as a college reportable score, the score could be used for college entrance admission purposes. If it had not been approved for that, then the score could still be used by the state for its purposes, for accountability, teacher evaluation, and so on. Can we go on to the next slide? Now for ACT and in most of the SAT states, accommodation requests need to be submitted to the test company. So a school district would complete whatever were the required forms, the request form. They may have to attach additional documentation to demonstrate the student's need for the accommodation, and then they send it off to the test company, which either approves or doesn't approve the accommodation. And then, as I previously described, if it is not approved, then the state can still allow it for state purposes. The one piece of variation there is that for ACT, in all states, the process I just described is how it works. Whereas for SAT, there is more variation across states depending upon the contract that the state has with SAT, and in at least one SAT state, and the one that I'm aware of is Connecticut, the state can approve both the college reportable and the state allowed. So they publish, Connecticut publishes an accommodations policy, and then when the request is submitted, if SAT has questions about it, isn't quite sure, then they need to come back and go through it with the state, and the state is the final decision maker. But Connecticut is definitely the exception, and not the way it is in most states. Next slide. Now, another thing that I want to just touch on just a bit is the National Education Technology Plan, which is was put out by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology. And this plan provides a vision of what it might look like if we had some really powerful learning experiences that are powered by technology, that are accessible to all students. And in the plan, for example, it says that the future of assessment, it compares the traditional assessments, the next generation assessments, with the goal of that the next generation of assessments are more flexible, more responsible, more contextualization, and accessibility that is universally designed in one of the features for the next generation assessments. And it says when both assistive technologies and assessments effectively interoperate, students are better able to demonstrate what they know and how to apply this knowledge. Next slide. Now, we've been talking quite a bit about, all the different things that technology-based assessments can do, some of the advantages of them when used with students with disabilities. But there are also some challenges, and one of the challenges is the inconsistent testing platforms for different assessments. And as it says on the slides, it might be more of a challenge for adults than for the students. I'm not even sure that's a correct statement. I think that different testing platforms, if a student has one platform or is taking the test with a dashboard that looks one way on the state test for reading and math, a totally different platform for their science or social studies assessment, and if they're an English learner, another platform when it comes to their English language proficiency assessment. It's just plain confusing for everybody. One of the areas that there have been particularly challenges is with scrolling issues, where there's just, you can't see everything on the screen. And this has been a recurring issue that the consortia all identified as being problematic, though it maybe have a greater impact on students with disabilities and English learners than other students. Next slide. Other challenges are with these first couple years of administration of the technology-based assessments, as these new next generation assessments have been rolling out, that there have been just a number of issues, including that you can't always turn off universal features. That for some students with disabilities, it may be problematic and make it more difficult for the student to successfully complete the test because of the universal features. For example, if a student has a tendency to want to adjust background colors and those kinds of things, and yet for a student, because of specific challenges related to their disability, one background color, one level of contrast is the best. That should be set ahead of time. There should be some way to turn off universal features that just aren't really helpful for a particular student, but that can't be done at this point in general. Another one is that sometimes it might be important to be able to limit the number of times that a student can reread something, even though in general that's universally allowed. But again, that in the past has not worked quite as intended. Next slide. Other challenges is that there really isn't any guidance out there on how to configure computers and other devices to handle videos. And a lot of these tutorials that the kids take prior to the test administration day really aren't all that kid-friendly and just can be challenging for a student to even understand all of the features and things that they really need to know about, because the tutorial was just written in ways or organized in ways that just weren't kid-friendly, and that has been a frequent challenge. Next slide. And another thing that we as NCEO have found to be quite frustrating, but I think we all should be worrying about it, and that is that the use of accessibility features and accommodations is not currently tracked. That one of the promises a few years ago as we were moving towards technology-based assessments was that we'd be able to track the use of accommodations as well as the other accessibility features. And then if we could track it, we'd know what kids were using, what worked, what didn't work. There's just so much information there, but the reality is that we don't really know what the kids are actually using, that the consortia assessments can keep track of what a student was assigned, but we're not really able to track what actually was selected, what actually was used by the student, and so that's been somewhat of a challenge. Even the very, very limited data that's available often, is not available can't really be gotten out of the systems so that we can analyze it and learn more about what's happening with accommodations. So that's just been a real challenge. Next slide. And there also have been a lot of concerns related to the use of assistive technology, and unfortunately in the past, too often students have not been allowed to use the assistive technology that they regularly use during instruction when they take an assessment. And this can just make things really difficult for the kids, and it's very problematic. The reasons that are generally given or why the kids can't use the assistive technology is that there are concerns about the lack of security. That, for example, if let's say that for text-to-speech, that there's an embedded text-to-speech feature in the testing platform, which might be quite different from what the child's used to, but that is considered more secure, and so sometimes the kids just aren't allowed to use what they're used to. There also have been a lot of issues with incompatibility between the third-party AT and the testing platforms that have been problematic. Next slide. And that as we talk about this, I guess most of the things that I've been talking about as I've gone through these challenges have been direct effects, things that you can say, well, this didn't work quite right, or there was this problem. But there are also just a lot of indirect effects when things don't go well, and a student can't access an assessment. And students with disabilities can become very frustrated and might not continue to try when other students might, become less frustrated and continue to try. That there's just so much variation there, but those indirect effects are something that's also very important not to lose sight of. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it back to Martha, and she can tell you about some solutions.
So thank you, Cheryl. As you were going through your comments, I was thinking of things like, oh, we should have said something about this, and we should have said something about that. So this is like boldly titled some solutions, but I'm afraid what we have here is not all the solutions that you need. We are just touching on some points that came out of the highlights that we had in the slides previously, and I know that we will think of more, and I'm sure that you can come up with some that you've found to be useful and you could share with us and with everyone else. So this first slide really goes off of the issue around assistive technology. There have been lots of issues, as Cheryl was indicating, related to assistive technology and it not working with the new technology-based assessments that we've been implementing. And really what I've got here is a couple of solutions related to the assistive technology issue. It takes a bigger group working on it. So it means, probably working with your assessment colleagues and getting them working with the test vendors, etc. So I think although we've put solutions out here that sound kind of simple, none of them are simple. So these related, as I said, relate to assistive technology. And one of the big issues that people had with assistive technology is that, it compromises our test security. And while we're worried about, students' personally identified information, that's not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about their precious items and having them get out where they might be exposed too much. So we definitely need to recognize that and come up with some test security kinds of solutions and procedures and policies that will ease that concern and enable the technology to be used for the assessment. And then just making sure that the goal is that what the student uses for instruction is what the student should be able to use in terms of assistive technology for the assessment. So working toward that goal, I think, is you know, one of those good solutions that we have to some of these issues around assistive technology. And the next slide also relates to that issue of assistive technology because it came up a lot without seemingly good solutions being addressed. So just, you know, helping your districts know that the students need to be familiar with their assistive technology that they're going to use on the assessment if, in fact, they cannot use what they're using in instruction on a daily basis, and they need to use something that's slightly different. They need to be familiar with that version that's slightly different from what they're used to using. They need to have practice, so practice test sessions are really important so that they see how that assistive technology works with that test environment. And you know, making sure that everybody knows that everything should be checked out before that test day so that the things don't get encountered on the test day when then the indirect effects that Sheryl talked about are more likely to occur. You know, one of the solutions, again, and this takes a teamwork, working with a vendor, is to really make sure that there are some tools and procedures that are available for LEAs so that they can really report on compatibility issues and so that there are procedures in place to say how they're going to be addressed in the future. I'm going to, we can go to the next slide, but I'm going to interrupt myself with one of the thoughts I had as Sheryl was talking. And I think she was, it was back to the nationally recognized high school assessments and what's going on there related to college reportable scores, and then back to some of the, you know, my conversation about the different tiers. And it occurred to me that nowhere in here did we say, as states, you need to make sure that your districts know, as districts, they need to make sure that their schools and IEP teams know that they need to be documenting all of the accessibility features that the student with a disability needed to participate on the assessment in a way that could show that student's knowledge and skills. Not just the accommodations that are now listed at that third level. Because what has happened is that many of the things that used to be called accommodations and that students needed to be able to show what they know and are able to do have moved up into that middle category, sometimes up into that first category. And it will be important to keep those things documented on the IEP so that as the student moves into a post-secondary setting, be it a job or a, you know, college or some kind of training, that there has been documentation of those features or accessibility features and accommodations that the student needed to be successful. So that was kind of a stray thought that I really think is really important. It's one of those solutions, making sure that IP teams know that it's really important to be documenting everything. Let's see, here, more solutions. And these are things that really should have been done, ideally, by the state as it developed its test or worked with a vendor to develop a test, but they might not have had time to do so, and it's really important that these things get done. So, making sure that the vendors are demonstrating the capabilities before signing a contract. Well, it might be too late for that now, but we need to be seeing those capabilities, and you all need to be looking at those capabilities because you have the perspective of that student with a disability and what some of those needs are. Making sure that there's practice tests and that educators know how important it is to have an opportunity to take those practice tests, not, let's see, how do I say this in a nice balanced way, not instead of instruction, but as part of an instructional process so that students are comfortable with the technology-based assessment. Always checking out the technology, not just the assessment items, not just trying to figure out what they're going to be tested on, but how they're going to be tested is going to be really important. I would argue that you should really push for involving students in cognitive labs and other kinds of usability studies, students with disabilities, so that we are sure that they are working in the intended way for our students. And then similarly, in any kinds of trials prior to testing, insist with your assessment and other colleagues that they be sure to include students with disabilities. Next slide. Here I'm going to take you to some work that we've done here at NCEO that came right off of the kind of the first administration of the technology-based assessments. We worked with colleagues at NCSI to kind of distill some of the lessons learned about that first administration as those lessons applied to including students with disabilities in the college and career ready assessments. And as we pursued that work, we found that, as you see, the first one here really focused on the instruction. That a lot of the issues related to the technology-based assessments were, in fact, instructional kinds of issues. And then the other document relates to things that were learned about the assessment. In each of these documents, kind of the problem is laid out or what the challenge was, and then in the first one, for example, it goes through some implications for instruction and then implications for anybody providing technical assistance. So there would be some great ideas in there for you as a state to think about doing to work with your districts and with schools. So, and then similarly for the assessment one, it really, you know, addresses in the same way. Here are some of the kind of the issues like unfamiliarity with this type of item, and then what does it mean for assessment and what does it mean for TA providers. So I encourage you to find those. They're on the NCEO website along with lots of other documents. These both came out in 2016. Okay, next slide. I'm going to move us along so we do have time for some questions. The other thing I think, which is this is never an easy solution, but one of the big things I think we have learned and that is going to help us as we move forward is that we really need to be working across agencies. And I know we say that a lot, but it's going to help in this as well, as probably in all other things. But, you know, we're having to make these decisions for all students now, students with disabilities, English learners, students who do not have any identified disability or are not EL. And I think you as special education leaders have a lot of knowledge and experience in the area of thinking about needs and potential solutions to meet those needs through accessibility features and accommodations. And I think you have a lot of wisdom to bring to some of the issues and challenges that we're facing right now. And so easy to say, harder to do, but breaking down those silos is something we need to keep working toward. And then as a last slide, so we do have some time, I just wanted to highlight that, you know, the need really to take information to the LEAs, particularly around some decision-making help. How do we make decisions now that we have this whole new kind of scheme of things, and maybe a whole new, more than one scheme of things within which we need to be working, and working with LEAs to help understand what those are in your state, because that decision-making has always been one of our biggest challenge areas. And then just providing that professional development and encouraging the practice by both students and adults as we move into thinking about what the law is asking us to be doing, what it means in the assessment world, but also in the instruction world for the benefit of all of our students with disabilities. Last slide just highlights who we are, I think. There we are, NCEO and CTD. So really appreciate your time today and hope that you will jump in with thoughts, questions, anything.
Okay, thank you so much, Martha and Cheryl. And yes, if you have any questions or thoughts about the presentation, you can enter that into the chat box and we'll read them out.
And just know that, you know, if you have none right now, we're always available. Both of us, both NCEO and CTD are very open to, you know, any conversations, questions, any way you prefer.
Excellent. We have a question here wondering whether they can get a copy of this PowerPoint, and we'll make both this recording and the PowerPoints available for all participants. We can send them out, I think, as a follow-up email and a link to the recording if you'd like to be able to watch it again.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Looks like we have another question here. Can you explain again why accessibility features have to be documented on the IEP?
Oh, okay. So this is my personal opinion. It is not any policy directive, but we have watched too many students have things not documented on their IEP, then move into a post-secondary environment where they still need that accommodation, say, but they've got no documentation of it, and they're not always the best at or have been trained in how to advocate for their needs. So without that documentation, it's likely that things that they really need could be denied. So that's why until our post-secondary world, or all those environments, the job settings, the colleges, etc., have opened up their thinking to the kinds of accessibility supports that the K-12 world and in the assessment world has pretty much opened up to. I think we need that documentation there for individual students so that we don't put them at risk of not being able to get a support that they need simply because it was no longer called an accommodation in the K-12 world, and so we didn't document it. I hope that was clear, and that you know it was my personal opinion.
Great, thank you. Let's see, scrolling through, and she says, yes, thank you, that was helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, how did you say we can access the recording? We will, this whole entire webinar has been recorded and create that as a video, but we will also send the final slides to you all. And I believe, actually, Nancy, you said you'd be happy to send these to all the state directors?
Absolutely. Yeah, be more than happy to.
Yeah, so we can make sure that we get these things out to you all so that you can share them with the people you work with or be able to go back and review any of the points that were discussed. And actually, on the CTD website, I can throw that link into the chat and send it out. Martha did a previous 2 series webinars for the entire CTD audience on sort of the basics, the ABCs, I think, of accommodations it was called.
Right.
And those are also available on our CTD website as a helpful starting point if you wanted to have another resource to share with your colleagues. And I will throw the link to that in the chat right now as well. Similar topic and similar points made and broken down into 2 webinars.
Right. And if you have nothing better to do, no, I shouldn't say it that way, but the NCEO website has a lot of information on it related to all the things that pop up related, you know, in terms of assessment and accommodations, but also a lot for related to these topics for ELs with disabilities, which I think in almost all of your states is going to be an increasing challenge that you need to be able to address.
Okay. It looks like that was our last question, but I'll just give people a few more seconds if they are typing. And while I'm doing that, I'll pull up those webinar links, Martha, to the previous webinars you did for CTD.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, I think I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think that's it. Again, thank you so much, Martha and Cheryl, for this really information-packed webinar. I found it very intriguing because assessments are not always part of my work, and so I definitely learned a lot from this content, and I hope everybody found this useful. Please feel free to reach out to any of us at CTD if you have other questions or you're looking for additional resources. And thank you too for Nancy for getting this all organized with your crew.
Yeah, and people can also shoot questions to me, and I can pass them along too. So,
yeah,
these folks know where to find me.
And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who joined in today.
Yes, thank you. And we will, once this recording is finalized, we will put together the slides and send those out to you, Nancy, and you can share them with everybody so that people can access this content.
Sounds like a good plan.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.